Good afternoon and welcome. Hope you're enjoying your lunch wherever you are. My name is Danny Grasso. I've been working or involved with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection since February 2017 and involved in advanced threat analytics and in Azure for over a year now. Uh, Today I wanted to take a look at what Microsoft are doing in the threat protection space and in ways that this can help us to be more secure in our businesses. This original presentation was taken from an Ignite session that was hosted by Chris Hallam and Heike Ritter on in Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. The code, that if you're going to look online and search for this code, all of the recordings for Ignite are available online. So the code is BRK2009 if you'd like to go and have a look at that. So what I wanted to look at today was an overview of the threat landscape and what's happening in that space. If you haven't heard about Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, that's okay. I'll go a little bit deeper for those that are already familiar with that, talk a little bit more about some of the new stuff in that space, take a brief look at the threat landscape, and then we'll look at Microsoft's strategy around this. Then I wanted to get into the product overview and some of the upcoming updates are in that space, and also then talk about some of the integration pieces with Microsoft Threat Protection and how this can help us to be more secure and the benefits around being more secure. So the challenges that we've seen, and we've talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks back already. As we grow, we're seeing increased attacks. You don't have the same, environment or borders that you had previously. Those are blurring, and if you had solutions that focused on premises security, those might need to change to accommodate for that changing digital estate, as it's called on the slide. And we also talked about how to deal with and correlate the number of alerts into more meaningful information that we can action. And that can be of great value if we can do that in an intelligent way, rather than just responding to those individual alerts and trying to keep on top of those. So from a security point of view, there's a lot of signal noise out there. There's a lot of different security areas that we're trying to stay on top of. And these are generally stitched together using seams. And the goal at Microsoft is to try and give a single view of this, make all of those independent solutions out there look like a single solution instead of a patchwork of solutions, to remove a lot of that complexity. And the ultimate goal here is to increase security. And we increase security because we want to limit the impacts of security, which generally costs us time and it costs us effort and it costs us productivity. So Microsoft's strategy around that is to look at changing their involvement in security. And so I wanted to talk quickly about Forefront security. And if people, I'm not sure if anyone remembers Forefront, if you've been in IT for a while, you may have, and you may have worked with a number or one of a number of those Forefront solutions. But what happened to Forefront? Microsoft didn't invest. They were in a different relationship at the time with the security ecosystem. The partnership model was Microsoft's focus, particularly around the Windows 7 endpoint days. And Microsoft were doing a lot of partnering with others for the security solutions like Symantec, McAfee, all of those endpoint security solutions that you might have used. Then Forefront was going to become something else, something different, and that kind of fizzled out. Microsoft didn't have the mindset at the time to know what they wanted it to be, and they didn't have the need at the time to invest deeply in that. Then around the Windows 8 era, Microsoft realized their strategy needed to change, that the security solutions out there, they were complex and they were plentiful, but they weren't delivering on the security needs that Microsoft saw as required. They were getting incrementally better. Microsoft decided they needed to build security inside the platform, and they did that because they wanted to secure the kernel, and they wanted to secure memory on machines against those types of memory and kernel-based attacks. This had an advantage for Microsoft in that by addressing these areas, they write the code. For the operating system, they know what the kernel looks like, so they can very heavily integrate. Third parties out there and partner solutions will integrate, but obviously they need to be more careful as Microsoft are making changes to that space to make sure that they're not impacting the operating system as much as Microsoft makes those changes. If Microsoft do an update, the third-party vendor needs to make sure that what they're doing in the kernel and memory scanning is not going to negatively impact the operating system, causing blue screens, those types of things. So there's additional work there for those third parties to kind of make sure they stay on top of that. And that naturally gives Microsoft an advantage. And Microsoft see themselves now as an equal participant in the security space. It's not just an outsourcing model anymore. And what they're doing is investing. So this $1 billion figure is not just an overall figure. This is a $1 billion annual investment that Microsoft are making. And there are only, I think, two other points in history that I can think of in Microsoft history where Microsoft have so heavily invested in something. And one was around the release of Netscape. Microsoft thought they might lose the platform to this new thing they didn't really understand at the time. So they invested a lot to try and gain market share back in that space. And when Linux was released as a client, that was the second time that I can remember that Microsoft thought, hey, we might lose the client to the resurgence of interest in Linux. So they invested very heavily in the client to address that. So it feels like Microsoft are in that same moment. And Microsoft feel like they're in that same moment from a security point of view, and then they're investing very heavily in that as a result. And so if I'm going to say, does this slide look familiar? This is a very used slide across a lot of presentations because it is at the core, particularly security presentations, but it is at the core of what Microsoft are doing. So Microsoft are gathering a large amount of data that's into this intelligent security graph. And Microsoft is able to reason over this huge amount of data with machine learning and all the great technologies associated around that, data science, AI, and they're able to come up with some pretty interesting results. And you can see some of those, the size of that data that they're analyzing. To be able to detect, if we look at that 5 billion threats detected on devices every month, that's a massive amount of data. And the competition doesn't have that data to work with. And Microsoft believe that to come up with or to resolve security, that it's a big data problem. It's if you've got more data, you can do more with that. You can draw more conclusions or draw more patterns the more data that you have. And so that's where Microsoft they have the data set, they have the investment, and they're now really motivated as a result to deliver on security. So when it comes to the approach, there are a lot of different products out there. And a few weeks ago, we saw the unification of those products and what Microsoft are trying to do in that space around the Microsoft 365 Security Center. So those key areas that are up on the screen at the moment: identity, endpoint, user data, cloud apps, and infrastructure. And the one we're looking at today, or we're focusing on, is around endpoints. And when you look at that 6.5 trillion signals per day, that's just an astounding amount of data that Microsoft worked through in that intelligent security graph. So we're going to start by looking at Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and I just wanted to very quickly talk to you about where that's come from and how it's gotten to where it is today. So late in Windows 8, leading into Windows 10, the start was Device Guard and Credential Guard. And then in the Fall Creators Update, the first endpoint detection and response solution was released. That was kind of the start of Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. And now all of that capability has come together under the one Defender brand. So you'll see Windows Defender Endpoint Protection, Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So coming under that Defender brand name. And Microsoft are not only providing a solution now that they want to compete with, and we'll see some of the things that we can do. And if you're familiar with WDATP, you'll know the innovation Microsoft is making in that space. But they not only want to compete, but they want to compete to win in that security space. And that's a pretty bold statement that they have. So this is just a reference slide that I wanted to run through, and for the people who know ATP, you will be aware of a lot of this stuff that's there. But really, ATP is not idle; it's evolving. Microsoft are continuing to innovate, and particularly in the October 2018 update was when we saw that information, that integration component really starting to build momentum. So there was DLP information feeding into ATP, but also ATP feeding information back into those systems such as Cloud App Security and the other ATP Cloud, Azure ATP solutions. So we're seeing a lot more integration in that space to enable that holistic view, or that strategic approach that Microsoft have to make this look like one security product. And that's a benefit to us, obviously, in our management. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So from a platform coverage point of view, obviously the Windows client is covered. Windows 7 SP1, Windows 8.1 is also covered under the platform. Servers through what was the OMS agent, now the Log Analytics agent, or sorry, the Security Center agent, as Microsoft are now rebranding that. And then the cross-platform capability for Linux, iOS, and Android being coming under that third-party umbrella through people like Bitdefender, SentinelOne, Ziften, and Lookout. System Center Endpoint Protection also feeds information into EMS. So if you're using System Center Endpoint Protection on Windows 7.1 machines, that'll feed into that. So the approach that Microsoft have here around Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection is starting with attack surface reduction. A lot of vendors start with next generation protection, and Microsoft want to start with attack surface reduction because they know that next generation protection is never going to be 100%. Reducing attack surface reduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about this shortly, enables us to reduce the number of exploits that are available to be taken advantage of. So next generation protection we'll talk a little bit more about later, what that means. Endpoint detection and response is a new part that you might have seen in Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, when you can investigate, respond to the advanced types of attacks, the behavioral-based attacks, not just the definition-based attacks. Auto investigation and remediation is an important part of that across both endpoint protection and EDR. Similar to how we've become accustomed to antivirus, automatically stopping malware without us doing anything. It detects, it stops. In some cases, might quarantine to make sure we haven't deleted an actual file. If we're not 100% sure, then quarantine that. We can come back to that and have some human interaction. So there's auto investigation and remediation in this advanced space to assist or to help us do less manual work, to do more automated work and make better use of our time. Security posture is an important part of this in viewing how we're traveling. And Microsoft uses a secure score in this space. You've probably seen that before. We'll take a look about that. And then centralized configuration and administration is obviously the approach there to have a good management structure and that single view, or that goal of that single view that we have. So let's take a closer look at attack surface reduction. So the need for attack surface reduction is basically software that is coded, is not going to be perfect. We're human, but the concept there is that something that comes out of the box might have a vulnerability. We install some software, there's a vulnerability. Before that vulnerability can get patched, we're vulnerable with that software. So if we're installing that software and there's a bug, we've got an attack, or the potential for attack. So reducing attack surface is reducing what we have on there by default or at our starting point to limit that impact. If you're using trusted software, or telling people they can only use trusted software, then you still have the potential for those vulnerabilities to be in that code, but you're limiting untrusted software, but then you're limiting productivity, and we want to try and avoid that, right? So when we look at the things we need to do around attack surface reduction, there are some things listed on the screen there to reduce the impact or reduce those threats being there from day one. Some of the things that Microsoft are doing in this space around applications in particular is that we know that apps run with a tremendous amount of privilege. You know, if I have a lot of privilege on my endpoint on my computer, and I run a browser that encounters malware, then malware is likely to have the privileges that I have on the system. So there's an opportunity to gain control of that system. So a browser running with your privilege, maybe it's not running your privilege, but possibly, you know, at least it has privilege to apps, other apps, and network connections. You know, that might not be enough to infect your system. You might only have permissions for it to jump across the network or to jump onto other systems, and so it might be enough for that exploit to run in memory. It might not be able to write to disk, but it might be able to even move laterally across systems. So it might be able to jump, you know, memory to memory in different systems. And we see examples of that. You know, the new types of attacks that don't actually write any data to disk and remain resident in memory only. So for system components, and when we talk about hardware isolation of applications, there are parts of the system that are isolated in containers. The authentication broker, which is now the credential guard, and then we're looking at that hardware isolated system container down the bottom there. So that if a browser exploit happens and a kernel vulnerability is exploited, the user has full access to the entire system, but they still don't have access to the Kerberos ticket on that system because that's protected, that's hardware isolated, and so they can't move laterally on that environment. Sure, your system is breached, and that's not a good thing, but at least we've reduced that ability to move laterally. So also virtual TPM is used in this space. It's used to protect Windows. Things like Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection itself, because one of the first things attackers like to do is to tamper with system defenses, right? If they know that people are going to be trying to stop them using advanced threat protection software or next generation protection, they're going to try and disable those defenses so that they can then move undetected from that point. So protecting that's an important part of it. So that doesn't protect the desktop, right? So if we look at the hardware isolated app container, protects the operating system, but not the apps. So if we use Edge as the example, because everybody uses Edge, right? You can click on malware. I use Edge, by the way. You can click on malware. You can try to install it, and where is it installed? It's installed essentially inside an isolated virtual machine, isolated by a hypervisor using that hardware isolation, where it has no ability to move to data or apps or anything else that you care about. Sure, at that point your browser is owned, and that's not necessarily a good thing either, but the host is protected, your other apps are protected. If you have application isolation, that it's protected by hardware. Now, I don't have an actual live demo, but what we're going to do is just run through like an animation here of what that looks like. So, and what Microsoft are doing in that space. So for people that don't use Microsoft Edge, and you launch Google Chrome here, I was going to say Microsoft Chrome, not yet. So you launch Chrome and you go to your trusted websites, and that's fine. We've got a website list that says I trust Bing.com, and whatever website I'm using, I trust LinkedIn.com, so that's not a problem. But if I go to a website that is not in my trusted list, such as Purple.com, then what happens is we open Microsoft Edge in an isolated application container. So from that point onwards, if that website is trying to do something malicious, then it's limited to that hardware isolated container, and your system is still safe. So that's one of the strategies that Microsoft are working with in that space for people who have that requirement. So right now, focusing on Microsoft Edge, obviously Microsoft produced that, and it's easier for them to start there. And we're going to see more in this space. So this is going to continue to improve. Microsoft are committing to providing this app-level hardware isolation for other browsers as well, and other applications as well. So I expect to see quite a bit more development in this space in particular around hardware isolation. So one of the other challenges, we're just still talking about surface attack reduction here, or attack surface reduction, I should say. So one of the challenges is the applications that we use. So what's our app list? What's our safe app list, I should say? It's difficult to maintain. Environments are dynamic. So as I mentioned before, if you introduce a safe app list, you're limiting the dynamic productivity that people have. They want to go and do something. They want to go and edit a video clip using an open source application. If we're not allowing that, then how do I enable people to be dynamic and do what they need to do and be productive while maintaining security? But what about stuff that's coming off the internet that is trustworthy? So what if there's some stuff that we can say we do automatically trust because it's been through some filters or been through some validation process? So in the last release of the Intelligent Security Graph, Microsoft are using that as a trusted source of information. So if users go to a website and they download a binary such as Adobe Reader, Microsoft will say, yep, we consider this a non-malicious app. We trust that, and then we have a platform or we have some information where we can bank on that and say, okay, well, if the Intelligent Security Graph trusts that, then I can go ahead and let my users install that. But there's a lot of other random stuff in the environment, right? So from an application control point of view, what Microsoft are trying to do, and what you're seeing up on the screen now, is that capability to audit an environment to look at our apps and how they're being used and what apps are being used, and to be able to then put some policies around that. And the important part here, though, is not just the capability to enable policies, but also to see how that's going to impact my environment before I go ahead and do that. So if I say, okay, these are trusted applications in my environment, and I'm going to allow those following publishers and the associated files within my environment, what is that going to look like? These are the known good files that relate to those vendors. These are the ones that would be blocked. And you can see by ticking those boxes and having a review of that, how that's going to impact the productivity of people. What application is going to get blocked? How many people are going to be impacted, or how many files are going to be impacted? And then there are some reports around that we can view to lessen the impact, or to at least be aware or have some advanced notification or direct people to use trusted applications before we turn off those applications that might be risky, or the ones that we don't know or aren't aware of or don't trust. So then moving on to exploit protection, there's a broad range of functionality there. If we're talking about attack surface reduction controls, they're hard to deploy. So what we don't know today is what applications depend on those behaviors. So if you take the example of, if I disable functionality within Windows, what is that impact is that going to have on the applications or the things that people are going to be doing? So on that screen there, before I get into this demo, if we look at the improvement actions there, just two-thirds of the way down the screen, where you block Office apps from launching child processors. So how do I know what impact that is going to have if I enable that? It might be a good security measure to do, but I want to limit impact, or know what impact I'm going to have before I enable that. So starting, if we look at the Security Center here, this is security.microsoft.com, which I can't show you live. That's not available just yet. I haven't seen it yet anyway. If anyone has, let me know. But the secure score is where we start. So there's added capability now in this new console to look at those key areas rather than individual alerts. So devices, data, identity, apps, and infrastructure. And we'll see that in a lot of the dashboards, those common areas for security. So if we go in and click on devices, and we say we want to block block Office apps from launching child processors. So we get a little bit of information and the types of controls that are applicable to devices, and we can review those audit results. We can turn on auditing, and then review those auditing results to say, if I enabled this, what's that going to look like in my environment? So the security team's been gathering that information since audit was enabled, and to see what would be the impact if we turn that on. Who are we going to impact, or what files You can see a lot of information there, the users, the devices, the source app, who we're going to impact. And if we group those by files, we can see, okay, these are the files that we're going to impact on devices, and we know what to target then. If I switch from audit mode to enforce mode, that gives me a much better, again, we can put a much better strategy to put in place, so that I can put some strategy or some rules around that to mitigate or limit the impact of turning that on. And then obviously we get the results of that afterwards. What does that look like from our secure score by enabling those changes? Our secure score goes up, and we can then focus on what are some other security improvements that can help my environment. And again, the secure score is one of those things where, just by virtue of the fact that you are looking at what improvements can be made, you're going to make improvements in your environment. That's one of the fundamentals of, and I've talked about this before, the fundamental approaches from Microsoft in that space. So if we talk about network protection in surface attack reduction, there's not a lot of news there. Microsoft are doing pretty good in that firewall space, except one thing, that the firewall experience for Intune and SCCM was inferior. Microsoft are focusing on bringing that up to par with the types of controls we have around group policy for firewall management. So let's move on now to next generation protection and why that's important, and why we need it. So, the attack surface reduction can dramatically increase your security posture, but, you still need some detection for the security or the surfaces that remain. The game has shifted from blocking recognizable executables to things that use sophisticated techniques. So you need some more behaviorally aware solutions. Regular updates, the definition-based updates can't keep up with threats that are emerging so quickly. And that hyperpolymorphic threats with 5 billion unique instances per month. 5 billion unique instances of malware per month is just massive to try and keep on top of when you're working with standard definition base. So Microsoft realized that need for next generation protection there. So when we're talking about next generation protection, this is completely transformed from signature-based and definition-based systems that's fully indexed on machine learning and AI. And this is using something that can scale as to that enormous 5 billion threat of unique malware instances per month. So it might not be completely unique malware types, but certainly the variations of that are unique and would require updates to signatures to detect that. So this is cloud-based, but it's not exclusively cloud-based. There are local models to protect against malware. It's fastest if you enable cloud integration there. And if we look at traditionally when we're updating in the past every week or every day, every 4 hours, 8 hours or 4 hours, is that enough anymore? Update every 2 hours. Microsoft are trying to get to the point where we're protecting at the top there. It's a bold target, protecting in milliseconds, protecting in seconds, protecting in minutes. As opposed to our traditional rates of catching up. So to stay on top of those zero-day exploits. So how is Microsoft Endpoint Protection stacking up right now? So, it's had a bad rap in the past, and Microsoft have invested quite a bit in this space, and they're testing themselves against independent AV testing companies. So AV Test is one that over the last year, Microsoft are doing pretty good on. SE Labs, AV Comparatives, Microsoft is seeing improvement there. Since we're looking at July 2017 onwards there. SE Labs are an interesting one because they're not just basing their responses against your traditional definition-based exploits, whereas AV Comparators and AV Test are doing that. SE Labs are actually looking at that complex behavioral attack type and how antivirus stacks up against that, or how next generation protection stacks up against that. And Microsoft have gotten a AAA rating in that, so they're doing very well in that space. So particularly around that highly complex malware prevention. Microsoft are doing so much better in that space now with endpoint protection and that cloud integration component. One of the interesting things is that all that Microsoft did was to do this virus total challenge. If you're not aware of what virus total is, it's basically just a giant library full of malware. So Microsoft run their systems against the malware that is coming into the virus total database. And what Microsoft found that they were up to approximately 30% faster at detecting their malware than their competitors. So that's not that the competitors didn't catch that, it's just that Microsoft found that 30% of the time they were catching it quicker, or catching it first before those other vendors were. So let's move on and talk a little bit about endpoint detection and response, which starts to move into that behavioral component. That's where Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, a lot of the components in there, where it operated as a standalone, where they really started to shine. So what is the need for endpoint detection and response? So one of the scary figures, and we see this often, there are some attacks that, phishing attacks in particular, jump in, steal data, get out of there really quickly. But in a lot of cases, there are 200 plus days that attackers have access to systems before they get detected, which is a big number that you want to reduce, obviously. 46% of compromised systems had no malware on them. That's pretty scary. And 99.9% of exploited vulnerabilities were basically there a year after they should have been patched. And attackers use evasion techniques in all of this. So in a lot of cases as well, it's difficult to make sense of the threats that are being detected. So we got a lot of alert noise. We don't have a good way to investigate, is that really malware? Is that really an attack? Is someone really doing something malicious on that system? So that's the needs around endpoint detection and response. We need those pieces to stop those pieces of malware that are coming through. It's kind of a post-breach mindset that rather than saying, if we get attacked, it's like when we get attacked, we need to be aware and be able to respond quickly and accordingly to that. So endpoint detection and response is deeply built into the operating system. There are telemetry sensors looking at a number of events that are happening on each computer, and these are then being sent to the cloud where that analytics and that machine learning takes place. These are all behavioral-based types of detection rather than the definition and response types of detection. And the unique approach that Microsoft has that I mentioned before was that capability to look into the kernel and the memory exploits to be able to hook very deeply into those, because Microsoft write the OS, they write the kernel, and they write Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. They have the capability to be able to integrate very heavily, and we don't see that upgrade pain that some other vendors might have, particularly around that memory or kernel update space. What does this look like? You may have seen this before. This is, again, the Microsoft 365 security portal. And so I can't show you this today. I don't have access to this yet. We should see this later this year. But this concept of rolling everything up into incidents instead of individual alerts. So, we've got a timeline at the top that gives us some rich information about when these incidents are occurring to give me an idea of how something's traveling through my environment. I can then go and have a look at, an alert view of what happened at that particular time, so I can see all of the alerts that were correlated together that made up that particular incident. And when I click on that, I can see some information about the type of thing that's running. We've seen some suspicious PowerShell, and we've seen this. It might be normal for you to run PowerShell in a certain way, but it's not normal for you to run PowerShell, with that specific command set, or to inject binary data into a PowerShell command. So from there, if we look at suspicious user behavior as well as that suspicious PowerShell, we're seeing some different behavior-driven or user behaviors that are kind of abnormal. So in this case, a golden ticket. Risk has been detected, And then we can click on what are the devices. We can see the devices that are affected. And one of the interesting things to note here is around those tags towards the middle of the screen there, where we can see, there's highly confidential information on 2 of those machines. We've detected that through information protection. And because we've got a high risk, and I'm probably jumping the gun here, but we've got a high risk that's been dynamically assigned with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and we've applied some conditional access policies around that. We can see the identities that are going to be affected by that incident, and then we can go ahead and look at, okay, what is our remediation state for that particular incident. So we go from, we had an alert, suspicious PowerShell. There's some conditional access and machine restrictions that have been put in place, so we've completed that remediation. There's some additional processes that run, then they get remediated, and then, in that case, once we're remediated, the risk level reduces on those machines. We remove those conditional access and machine restrictions that we put in place. Remediations are complete and people can continue on. So from a life cycle point of view, just because we get suspicious PowerShell, we don't need to necessarily stop everything. We may want to be involved in that and have a human decision in that process, but we may want that to be basically a machine investigation that takes place, puts those protections in place while we're investigating, and then once those investigations have completed and the threat has been removed or identified, then we can return those devices and those users back to their normal state of working. So that's just an example of that automatic remediation thing. And then we get the capability to view what has taken place. So in great detail, we can see, a lot of that, the detail that would take a person a heck of a lot of time to work through on an individual machine to determine that machine is clean. And that's where the benefit of something that can automatically look at the behaviors, base that against a huge amount of knowledge from the intelligence security graph, and make an assessment and a decision based on that, rather than us manually trying to work through that on individual machines. And that's an amazing improvement in how we can handle security. And the information, the ability to actually go and see what has been checked for us to feel comfortable as well is important to know, that what has been looked at is what we also agree that should have been looked at. So we still have that element of human involvement and investigation there. Which kind of leads into the auto investigation and remediation. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit there. But why do we have the need for automation? I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit already. Time's important. We've got a lot of stuff that we need to work through. The more alerts we get, the more we have to do. The more threats we have, the more we have to investigate. Manual remediation, there's a time investment there. It's expensive to have people who are knowledgeable, very knowledgeable to have that, and also the size of businesses. There's not a lot of small businesses out there that can afford to have a dedicated security officer. And so having systems that do a lot of that for you in an automated way is of incredible importance. That's basically a cost factor. If a machine can do that for you, that automatic remediation, then, or that automation, then we don't have to have as much human expertise in that space, or involvement in that space, and that's pretty important. So we've talked about, we did this with AV and Endpoint in the past, so why not endpoint detection and response? The semi-automated option we've talked about is capable right now, so you can be involved and say, no, I don't want it to be fully automated. I want to review what you've detected, validate that, and then go ahead and say, yep, I'm happy with that, let's go clean up. Or we can fully remediate. So the automated investigations, I just quickly wanted to jump across and give you an example of what that looks like. So if we jump into the Windows Security Center dashboard, and we go into our automated investigations. Once the portal refreshes for me, there, it just timed out. Nice secure portal. Okay, so let's take a look at the automated investigations that have taken place. I'm going to have a look at this Windows Defender detected bundle loader unwanted software. Um, and when this loads, what we're going to see is similar to what we saw in the slide deck. We're going to see an investigation graph that tells us everything that was scanned on this machine, 3,443 machines, one file was remediated, all those processes, services, drivers, IP addresses, URLs, 293 persistent methods, there was one threat that we found, there was an alert received, we saw this on one machine. We waited for that machine for 4 hours and 10 minutes, so the total time here was for remediation was 5 hours and 30 minutes. So we detected it. That machine potentially went offline, lost network connectivity for those 4 hours and 10 minutes, and then we came back online and we were able to do some action and remediate that. So we get a good idea of the things that have been done. We can actually drill down on those. So those are clickable links. Those 3,443 files. If I wanted to drill down into that through the entities view here rather than from that screen. So I could look at, here are the 3,443 files that were scanned, and we found those to be clean. We didn't see any suspicious behavior or any definitions or any cloud analytics that indicated that these files had anything malicious done to them. Drivers, there's a lot of information here that you can review, log files. And then the key findings that we found: this particular file, drv setup bracket1.exe, looked a bit or was detected as being malicious, and the file was quarantined. So if we think that that's not the case, we could go and do some other methods to detonate that file securely in an environment, and Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection has the capability to do that, to then see exactly what that file was doing, or what it's trying to do, like files that it touches, websites, registry entries, all those types of things that it does there. And the other bit that I wanted to quickly show you was around the threat analytics side here. So this is valuable, particularly around. I might be jumping the gun here a little bit, but I'll show you this now. The threat analytics component is where we have a lot of information coming from third-party sources that tell us. In the past, we might get these via email or via boards that we subscribe to, RSS feeds, whatever, so that we can see, hey, here's an exploit that attacks Windows 10, or attacks the government, or attacks this website. Read about it in the news, and we have to do some investigation to say, how does that actually affect me? So what Microsoft are trying to do in this space is for us to say, okay, there's a threat out there, this Adwind RAT lands using DDE exploit. How am I affected? I had one machine, and this was a test that I did through Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection to validate how we saw this information. But we can see immediately what my mitigation status looks like. I had one machine where I had that threat, and we resolved that threat. But from a mitigation point of view, I'm looking pretty good. I have one machine that's uncontactable at the moment. I might want to go in and make sure that machine's either decommissioned or fix up the reason why it's not communicating correctly. But my other 45 machines are all mitigated against that threat. So I know immediately that based on that attack, my Windows 10 machines, or those 46 machines, are all protected. And I don't need to go ahead, and I can go and view that machine list and get an idea of which machines. If I had something that was unmitigated, I could go and find that machine and say to our managed services guys or our IT guys, hey, can you go ahead and run some manual mitigation, or can you go and fix up the communication with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, or is there a problem with that machine that we need to fix? Do we need to re-image it so it's talking to us again in the correct way? So those are the types of things that are available there. So I'll flick back across to our slide deck and talk about security posture. And the importance here, as we've talked about, is that you can sometimes, when you implement security solutions, you don't have visibility of how your security investments pay off. So people will come to you and say, two outcomes in every day. The first outcome is, hey, there was no news. everything's working well. There were no attacks. And the second outcome is that you get attacked and you have a bad day, and people come to you and say, "What are you doing? What are we doing from a security point of view?" So having no visibility in that first scenario is bad, because you need people to see how well the security solution is protecting you. You need prioritization as well to know where to start. Um, you need to be able to have that visibility, particularly about our security investments. We don't want to wait until we have that incident before we do something about that, or before we act on security. And so the security posture, we've talked about this before, and we've seen the secure score, and how that helps us to improve our security posture just by fact that someone is suggesting that here are some things that you can do to improve security. We go ahead and we pick the ones that are most impacting or most important for us, and we apply those, and then move on to the ones that that are going to help us. But having visibility means that we can act on that. So from a security posture point of view, I might skip over that demo. I think we've seen that. Actually, no, I won't. I'll quickly jump in. It's a very quick demo, and it's very, very valuable. So if you look at the secure score, and basically we've got a secure score in this case of Windows endpoints and Office 365. From that Microsoft 365 security dashboard, we'll get a different view once that's available, and the more solutions we add into that, the more visibility we will have around those identity, endpoint, etc. Components of security. But the secure score gives us an idea of how we're traveling over time. I can very quickly see that we were pretty good at security updates here on November the 9th, and then we dropped down on November the 10th. So I'm guessing there must have been a Patch Tuesday, a bunch of security updates that were released, and we've been a little bit slow in enabling those security updates. So we might want to get on to that and make sure that our updates are being deployed in the way that that they should be, that there's not a problem there. And then it tells us what our score will go up by, and that's the whole point here, is that not to try and achieve the 800 out of 800. That from Microsoft's point of view, that's great. From my point of view and my business point of view, I need to pick the things that make sense, the things that I know are going to impact me, or that are the highest risk things that are going to help me out. But again, by virtue of the fact that I can just see that we're traveling really good at EDR, pretty good at antivirus, but OS security updates is where I need to focus my action on. So I've got a very clear direction as to what I need to do, just simply by looking at this one pane. And so that's a very valuable tool and method of moving forward. And that kind of leans into that security management component of understanding what's happening. So if we look at the security management dashboard, and this is the one, the Microsoft 365 Security Center that I mentioned, where we see that secure score on the left there based on devices, data, identity, apps, infrastructure, those key areas, and being integrated together. Depending on the products you use, the more information, or cards as Microsoft calls these, that you can add in there, and the more experiences show up. So this is the framework for the security products that you use. And you'll get a richer experience the more security products you use, the more they'll integrate, and the more you'll get that incident-driven view based on those key areas, as opposed to individual alerting. And this dashboard is designed to drive action. So it's kind of like, what do I need to focus on? What are the things that are impacting my environment, or that are at risk to my environment, that I need to act in? And that's Microsoft's approach here. They want this to be action-driven, so that we have some really clear direction as to what you need to do. Down the bottom there, you can see there are some basics as Microsoft are adding more information, changing, because this is a cloud solution. Obviously, it's going to develop, it's going to evolve. There'll be new things that are brought on very regularly. And there's a way there that Microsoft want to try and filter that information up to you about what's changing and where to go to get that information. The purpose of this slide is not to read through that information, but Microsoft are getting reporting and monitoring access across different entities, and not just a single view of each individual product. So we're going to see more of that global analytics view. In WDATP, the threat analytics section, we saw the impact of a of a threat based on an alert, or a not an alert, rather an advisory, security advisory, and we were able to see how that impacted our environment. We're going to see more of that style of information, not just generic information that I then need to go and try and determine what the impact is to my environment, but evaluating that and telling me what the impact is going to be to my environment, what I need to do to mitigate any risk that's there. And that's a pretty important part of that. So part of that security management is around threat reports when we talk about that. So Microsoft are trying to focus on reports that people find valuable from other security reporting software. And Microsoft again are focusing this on driving action and results, not necessarily just to give you a tailored or a specific report. And it's not an excuse not to have as many reports, but that's the approach again. That's that approach that Microsoft have, that focused and action-driven reporting information. So threat protection and actions taken, so this is so that we have visibility to prove the value of the security solution that we're using. And then again, some additional reporting information there about alerts that we've seen, stopped, how we're still at risk, what we're doing about that. There are also some health reports there. It's important that the computers are talking to the security systems adequately. If they're not, you want to determine which machines those are, and then you want to resolve those so that you have a higher coverage to protect the environment as thoroughly as possible. And then obviously there's some more. So not obviously, but there are some more reports there that Microsoft have provided based on health, by OS. And these are just visualizations that Microsoft are introducing that they're finding are important pieces of information that are the ones that people generally tend to request the most. So that's kind of a wrap up of the components there that make up Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. And what I wanted to talk about now was the end-to-end approach that Microsoft have with threat protection across the board. So not just endpoint threat protection. And some of the things that Microsoft are doing in that space, particularly around sharing to the intelligence security graph. One of the really interesting things that I think I may have mentioned in the past, I may not have, is that the information that Microsoft are gathering out of the intelligence security graph, Microsoft are actually making available through APIs to other vendors to gain the benefit of that. So the learnings that they're finding, they're not just keeping to themselves, they're making available as an additional platform or an additional source of information based on those findings that other security vendors can capitalize on, which is really interesting. I found that really interesting. But the sharing that we have from endpoints to the intelligence security graph, from Office to Azure to Windows and back and forth, integration between the products is aiming to be seamless. That's where Microsoft wants to be. So, Office 365 can trigger an automated response to an endpoint with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. That's the ultimate aim. We pick something up that we saw in Office 365 ATP. We instruct Windows Defender ATP that this is a threat if you find this, or it comes another way through a system. If someone saved that email to a USB and plugged into another computer on your network, it hasn't come through Office 365 ATP, then Windows Defender ATP should be able to say, hey, Office 365 ATP told me this was malicious, and stop that email from being opened, or the payload of that email from being actioned. So that's that kind of remediation action. I think there's another example coming up. So the conditional access integration component is pretty important here. So the concept is that we saw this before. I think I mentioned those tags where we identified that there was some critical information on those systems using Azure Information Protection. And so as a result of that, and the fact that we had some behavioral anomalies detected through advanced threat detection, or EDR, we determined that machine was now at risk. And as a result of that, what we can do is say, here's a conditional access policy that says if the machine risk is high, then we're going to do something. We're either going to deny access until that risk dynamically returns to low. We're going to force a password reset because we want to make sure that identity is protected. We want to limit access or require MFA. Whatever controls that we want that conditional access policy to have can dynamically be assigned integrated with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection based on those risk levels. So when the risk level via Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection is determined to be high, it feeds into Azure Active Directory Conditional Access. Conditional Access enacts the policy. When Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection finishes its remediation, similar to that example we saw earlier on, the threat or the risk level returns from high back to low, and then as a result, whatever conditional access action we put in place, requiring MFA or password reset, sorry, that's not a good example, limiting access or whatever, or MFA, will then be removed as part of that, and that person's access would return to normal. So there's a lot of capability with integration there to do those types of things dynamically to help further protect your environment. So the one that I mentioned before, synced actions across Office 365, Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. I like this example. So an attacker sends a phishing email that looks okay to start with, right? So they sent an email that had a link to kittensarecute.com, and everyone loves a good cat video on the internet, so we clicked on that, and hey, look, there's a cute kitten, fantastic. But later on, an attacker goes, after they've sent that email across to millions of people worldwide, they arm this, so they go and redirect DNS from kittensarecute.com to hackers.com. So now the link doesn't match. They've done some malicious actions. That's bad, but that email is already in somebody's mailbox. They might not have clicked on it. They might forward it to someone else and say, "Hey, look, here's a cute kitten video," or click on that link after it's been armed. So Office 365 ATP says, "Hey, we've detected a problem." It sends an alert to Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection to ensure where the email landed on the endpoint, that Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection can take the action. So it can say, "Hey, this didn't get detected when it was delivered because it wasn't armed then, and now it has been armed. Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection takes some action, clean that up for us." So I guess in summary, there are some resources that you can use to get started with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. There's a 60-day trial, I think it is. Some resources there. There's some Microsoft case studies that you can read up on. So the trial is actually a full trial. It's not hold at all. So you get 100% of the experience. If you want to go ahead and try that out, and I suggest you do. So if we take a look again at the WDATP, or the Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection approach to security for endpoints and how Microsoft are working in this space, the concept is end-to-end, and integration is key across a number of solutions, not just the endpoint solution. And then the whole aim here is to enable you to better secure endpoints. You want to limit the impact of better security. You want to do this in a more automated and more seamless way. But obviously, improving security is incredibly important, because that also impacts you when you have an accident or an incident, as to your cost, your productivity. The more you increase security, the balance there needs to be in Microsoft's approach. I think we mentioned before is security and productivity, not security versus productivity. That's always a hard thing to balance or in the past. So having an approach where you're thinking about the two together is important. So to both lessen the costs of better security and improve productivity while doing this is an incredibly key part of all of the security and the security approach that Microsoft have. So thank you very much for listening. The Ignite content I mentioned before is available at that URL. I think most of, not all of, but most of the breakout sessions are there, plus a couple of Expo Hall recordings are also there, some valuable ones. And please also visit us at www.jasco.net.au. We'll be posting these recordings online shortly, so if you'd like to review those. And coming up next week, we have Attaching the Power of Microsoft 365 Cloud Management and Security to Config Manager. This is an interesting one, where we're taking or looking at what Microsoft have done with Configuration Manager and taking that from a very static product to a product that looks more like a cloud and is now heavily integrating with cloud to provide much better solutions. So great interest there and great topic. So thank you very much for your time. Talk to you again soon.